Well, Shabbat Shalom. I am sitting here with my holy and wise mother-in-law, Carol Rose, who, in addition to producing one of the greatest human beings to ever grace the earth, my wife, Adira, she is a writer and a scholar and a poet and an educator and has now for many years been my teacher. And I invited her to join us this Shabbat to talk a little bit about the Torah portion. And the parsha this week is Parashat Va-Yishlah. It begins with the reunification of Jacob and his brother Esav after a long period of alienation and enmity between the two. And then after that encounter, the scene really radically shifts to one of the most disturbing stories in all of the Torah. It's in Genesis chapter 34, and it's a story of the daughter of Leah and Jacob named Dinah, who in the land in which Jacob and his family come to settle, the land of Shechem, Dinah goes out. That's where the passage begins in chapter 34. Vatetse Dinah bat Leah, that Dinah, the daughter of Leah, went out to visit the daughters of the land. It says Shechem, son of Hamor, the Chivite chief of the country, saw her and took her and lay with her by force. The Hebrew there, Vayikachota, took her, Vishkavota, V'yaneha, and laid down with her or slept with her and harmed her. And then the plot thickens, I suppose, by saying, Vatidbak nafsho b'Dinah. His soul was bound up or clung to Dinah, and v'yahevet na'ara. He loved the maiden, and he spoke to the maiden tenderly. And so Shechem said to his father Hamor, "Get me this girl as a wife." And the narrative continues with Hamor then going to Jacob and making a proposition to him that Dinah be given to his son Shechem as a wife, and further, I think, tries to sweeten the deal by saying, we'll kind of unite all of our tribes in this land, and all of your daughters will marry our sons, and all of our sons will marry your daughters, and we'll be one big happy family. Won't it all be nice? And Dinah's brothers hear of what had transpired in these deliberations and are furious about what had happened, and say to Hamor that and to Shechem, we're not going to let Dinah marry Shechem, and we're not going to let our daughters marry your sons because they are uncircumcised, and that is abhorrent to us. And so Hamor and Shechem gather all of the men of the city and say, here's the deal. We want to intermarry with this clan, but they need us all to be circumcised. So they all on the spot circumcise themselves. And then on the third day following the circumcision, when all of the men are nursing their wounds and at their most vulnerable, the brothers Shimon and Levi come to the town and slaughter everyone and take all of the women and children captive and despoil the entire town. And then Shabbat Shalom. So it's a really challenging, disturbing story. And I thought, who better to help make heads or tails of this uncomfortable narrative than my dear mother-in-law, Carol Rose. So first of all, Ima, Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Can you hear me?
Can hear you loud and clear. It's so good to have you. So I'm wondering, how are you making sense of this story this year?
Yeah, it's a terrible story, and it's difficult to make sense of. And I guess all I can do this year is raise more questions. That's the best way I can deal with the story, because even in your telling, which I know is thoughtful and considerate of the characters in the story, Dinah is almost obliterated, right? It becomes the story of Shechem, it becomes the story of Amor, it becomes the story of Yaakov, it becomes the story of her brothers, it becomes that story. So where in the world is she in this story? Which is kind of the first question. that I always ask about women in this story, but Dinah probably more profoundly. So this year, I had written for Adira 35 years ago, or probably more, 36 years ago, a set of cards in anticipation of her arrival, illustrations and kind of poetic midrash for her to begin to know the women in text. And of course, I hope my sons and son-in-laws would also enjoy that. But it was really for her. And at the time, this is a long time ago, this is what I was thinking about Dinah. And it came to mind again, because I think what came to mind is the kind of freshness of a young woman's maturation. The kind of, if you've lived inside a young woman's body, the excitement of being able to move freely and delight in your own physicality and experience your own sexuality, if it was, just as a young teenage woman. So that's what I wrote about. And I'm going to read that just briefly. Barefoot, you come from tent breast folds drawn by bouquets of warm winds, caressing your legs, raising your skirts, urging flowers to spill their secret fragrances. Your movement is open, vulnerable, light, touching all things to life with your step, until lust rage is unbalanced and you fall, crying the cry that echoes eternally in our hearts. And she became kind of the card of vulnerability, leaving her tent and going out. And the rabbis make a great deal out of her going out. So one of the things that I thought about is I wanted to count how many times Dinah's named, because often women aren't named in the text. And when you told the story, we heard about her once. She's named by name 6 times. She's named as the daughter of Leah 1 time. She's named as the daughter of Jacob 4 times, and as the sister of her brothers 4 times. So she's in that text all the time. And yet when the story is told, what are we missing? We're missing the life of a young woman who went out and totally trusted her environment. But more than that, I think my chap for this year, or my insight for this year, is that she comes from a family that journeyed out. Her grandfather, her father, her uncles, these were men who took journeys and discovered themselves and discovered their God, in fact, discovered their spirituality, their identity. They wrestled with angels along the way. Wouldn't she be curious about stepping out? And the other thing that I noticed is that some rabbis, when they do talk about Dinah as the daughter of Leah, they point out that Leah stepped out, that Leah was someone who took destiny in her hands, like her aunt, Rachel, took destiny in her own hands. These were women who knew how to acquire what they needed in the moment. And I think Dinah was just curious, alive, full of spunk, and more than that, really, she came from a tradition, I think, that went out. They were the crosser-overs, the Ivrim. They were people who left what was known for the unknown. And so that's what came to mind for me this year. And also that Leah was the person who went out and, got her husband to be with her in a transactional manner by trading off the mandrakes for a night with Yaakov. So these are people who knew how to negotiate and work things out. And, maybe Dinah had a little bit of that in her too, that kind of curiosity and willingness to explore and be open. And maybe they had a reputation in that area for being negotiators. So, maybe Hamor, they knew that there were ways in which you could negotiate with this group of people. This sheikh that I see Yaakov as this kind of equal in status to Hamor in a smaller way, but had a great deal of prestige, wealth, status in his clan, and this young, entitled son of Hamor, they call him a prince in the text,
Right.
um, feels that he's entitled to whatever's around, what way. And remember, women were collateral. They were just like sheep. They were available for negotiation for transactional purposes. So, um, in the context of their history, bargaining and trading would not be unusual. Maybe Hamor knew about that. Maybe Shem knew about that. I think it's ridiculous to keep redeeming him, keep redeeming this entitled young prince by saying that he fell madly in love with her. And it's a nice tale. It's an apologetic, but we still don't know Dinah any better. We don't know what she felt. We don't know what this trauma brought brought out for her. We never hear from her again. We don't really hear from her. So there's a big question mark, but I always see the question mark as an opportunity for new and creative midrash. So,
wow. I mean, there's so much there, and I also, in as much as the story itself is unsettling, to read the classical rabbinic commentaries on it is in some ways, even more unsettling. Rashi points out, right, ki ima ki bita, right, like daughter, like mother, right, all these women stepping out, and there is this sense among some of the commentators, not all of them, sense among some of the commentators that that the fact of her stepping out, the fact of her going out and leaving, was it's like the sort of classic contemporary refrain of what she was wearing, she was asking for it, that sort of thing. And you're right, studying, I don't think I had really noted that until looking at it this year, that that Dinah, the story starts with Dinah as the protagonist of her narrative, and then you never hear from her again. You don't hear one word uttered from her, and she's relegated to the sidelines of her own story by this act of sexual violence, by the violence of her brothers, by the manipulations of the men around her. But what I was intrigued most about in what you shared is that you cast Dinah as the symbol of vulnerability, and to me, the Yitzia, the like going out, strikes me as courageous in a way, right? She's going to explore, right? She sees that she is from a family of people who step out of their comfort zones, and she wants to go and experience what that's like. And I suppose that there's a certain courage in making yourself vulnerable like that.
right.
But I'm wondering if you could unpack that a little bit about why vulnerability.
Good point. I think maybe I had another thought. I mean, that's a really good point. I think that there is great courage, but it's that kind of adolescent courage, in that that infallibility. Nothing will happen to me after all. My uncles went out, my dad went out, my mom. There's that kind of adolescent courage, I think. But I was thinking of it more in a spiritual sense of the nar, or the novice, who steps into something, the unknown, very receptive and open and trusting. So I think all spiritual journeys start out that way. The tarot cards, for instance, have the knave, the fool, even in some cultures, the fool, that innocent, optimistic, daring, that kind of, and that's really what I had in mind, that kind of openness that we can call courage, or we can say is, you'll sustain that kind of courage until your first fall. So
Hmm.
yeah.
Is the moral of the story about how to, about what the experience of living um, as an underprivileged category of person in a world where there is so much power and privilege around you, like, right? Like I see that in this, right? Like because like my father was a person who stepped out. My grandfather. I come from a family of explorers and movers, right? And so her maybe naivete, but her feeling that like I should be able to go out into this world too, and then the world around her says, "No, you can't." Um,
Story I think every woman encounters. I should be able to. And yet I didn't teach my boys how to listen for every footstep as I taught Adira. And I didn't teach my boys to carry their car keys in their hand in case they have to, So I think that's the story. The story is that women still ought to be able to. And the world just hasn't made that actually possible. And if our culture has improved at all, think about places like India, where this is still very much an alive story, a very alive story. So, what's the takeaway? It's to raise more conscious individuals to be aware that this is still a story. Um, and, you can think about the benefits of being a privileged male.
right.
Or you can think about Lilo going out for a walk someday.
Right. So I read the story, and in addition to being, horrified, it frightens me, as as what her experience is still in 2020 going to be like. And I wonder, is there a moral to this story? Like, is this a story that we're given to, limoduk bel schar, like learn it and you'll receive a reward? Is the point of the story like for us to be outraged by it? Or is there something else going on here that we're given this story to reflect on and to learn something? What are we supposed to learn from this?
Well, I think we should be outraged. I think, and we shouldn't sidestep. I think we have to catch ourselves in reading this story and think about not sidestepping from this horror, facing it and acknowledging it, and feeling responsible in some way for the society that Lila will walk around in. I mean, all the children, but
Right.
in this case, because we're talking about Dinah, I think what we learn is to be more aware of the fact that this is real. It's a problem, and you can't talk about the side stories or the other negotiations that happen in life. Um, I've seen some scholars who've written about the story of Dinah and I Can't Breathe, for
Mm,
instance, or what are the vulnerable places that still have to be attended to? What can we, as conscious,
right.
spiritual, mature adults, do to provide safety for those vulnerable individuals? I think that's the question, the lesson. I don't know. It comes in many forms, but certainly not to sidestep it, not to make excuses for it. You
Right.
know,
As you were sharing that, that you didn't have to teach your sons what you had to teach Adira, right? And still probably today we're not going to have to teach Shemai and Akiva what we have to teach Lila, about how to navigate the world as a young woman, and ultimately as a woman. And we spent a lot of time this summer, especially in the language of I Can't Breathe, talking about how folks that look like me, folks that look like us, like I never had a conversation with my parents about about what to do when you encounter a police officer, other than be polite and respectful, and they're there to help, or they're there at least to do their job and make sure that no one's breaking the law. And only kind of eventually later in my life coming to the realization that that was not everybody's experience with law enforcement. And there's also a piece in the story that really struck me, that when Shimon and Levi come to the town, they don't just kill Shem for the crime that he committed against their sister, or his father for trying to compound the horror. They kill. Yeah, they kill every single person, every single man in the town, as if to say that all of those people are responsible for what Shem did or what Shem was allowed to do. And there's a that's very that tracks to I think the Torah's like general sense of justice, right? That what Heschel said, that in a society some are guilty but all are responsible. Like everybody in the town is responsible for having abided a culture in which this entitled jerk is able to feels like he's able to do what he wants, and so they all deserve in some way to be implicated in the crime. But I'm not so sure. Like I don't think that Shimon and Levi are the hero. I'm not sure that Shimon and Levi are the heroes of the story either.
I'm not sure that they're the heroes of the story, and again, commentaries bend over backwards to say, well, they were her real brothers, and they were the biological brothers, and therefore they had every right to protect her honor. It had nothing to do with her honor. It really had a lot to do with Jacob's honor, their own honor. And I think an undercurrent in the story for me is the fact that this trading of women was very acceptable. We'll marry you, you'll marry our daughters, we'll take your daughters, you'll take our daughters. This was a way of establishing kinyan. You were make a deal. Let's make a deal. And women were just at the center of this deal. In fact, taking of the daughters, the transactional thing happens 3 times in the story. If something happens 3 times, it's worth noting. One person says it, then another person says it, another person says it. So Hamor says it, Yaakov says it, brothers say it. And you can count them because I sat and underlined it today before speaking. In preparation for this. So that transactional, that women are part of how you cut a deal to increase your power,
right?
Is something we really need to pay attention to in our society, and the vulnerable in ways in which they become collateral for our own progress. And I think that's not a new story, it's an old story, but if we don't tell it for what it is over and over again, we've seen over the last few years what can happen.
Right, and it feels to me as you're as we're talking about this that that what's at stake, the stakes in the story as it's told, right, are lust and greed on Shem and Hamor's part. Power is very much at play in the story. Pride is very much at play in the story, right? And what's revenge, and what's not at play in the story at all is like, what is Dinah's experience? How does she feel? How do we take it right? Not once do the brothers say, like, let's go check in on her and like see how she's doing after all of this.
And not once does the text follow up on that.
Right.
There's no trauma of Dinah. There's no follow-up. There's no restoration of Dinah. There's no marriage of Dinah. There's only a hiding, as in Jacob when he needed to get further himself, right? In life, hid her in a box and schlepped her across, tried to hide her. So the hiding of Dinah is really a theme all throughout this. Dinah's person isn't respected. Dinah's emotions aren't respected. Dinah's face is unknown. Dinah's voice is never heard.
Mm.
You know, so there's a lot to learn from this.
Right. And so maybe that's one of the lessons is, because Dina's voice is not heard in the story, maybe what we're charged to do is to perpetually try to uncover and lift up Dina's voice, and have it actually speak to us and instruct us. Before we wrap up, I think you mentioned that there was a poem that you wanted to share that was
Yeah,
connected with
sort of.
this.
Thanks. Well, it's roundabout, roundabout. So it's, midrashic meandering,
Sure.
but it was written for one of your teachers, actually, Rabbi,
Mhm.
who is a wonderful teacher. And this was written many, many years ago, long before she became a rabbi. And you'll see why I think it relates to Dinah, because remember at the beginning I said she's named 6 times in the text as Dinah. If you didn't hear it once, this is her name. If you didn't hear it twice, this is her name. But she still remains, um, there's a void. She's
And
been,
that I love that too. That and that was a refrain throughout the summer of the Black Lives Matter protests was say their names, right? These are human beings who had lives and a story, right? They're not just props in somebody else's story.
okay, so for all those. So this is for Mimi. She's been trained to question, ask, inquire, to wrestle answers from husks of complacency, peeling away layers, raw, bloody, never allowing protective scarring. She lives in Jerusalem, of course, and riddle solving has a long history there, developed over centuries by bearded rabbis searching for meaning in a single word and its location, or in the number of times it appears on the page. People of the book seeking answers from ancient scrolls, unraveling truths letter by letter from parchment, punctuated by the blank spaces where her questions originate, her own questions about what seems to be missing, what appears by innuendo alone, or about what is not yet written. This exegetic process she has learned so well calls attention to the emptiness she feels inside each time the sacred law is opened to the oft time nameless and more frequently shapeless lives of women whose stories are recorded in only the faintest of ink.
Mm.
Thank you.
Is that in Behind the Blue Gate?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, yeah. So that's Carol's collection, first collection of poetry, which is an extraordinary collection. If you haven't had a chance to take a look at it, I really encourage you to do it and own a copy. Ima, it was such a joy and such an honor to be able to discuss this with you, and so appreciate your insight and your wisdom about this challenging story, but one that calls to us and reminds us to lift up the names of those who are cast aside in their own stories, and to ensure that their voices speak to us still today.
Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to learn with you. I miss that. So I guess I'll have to come to your congregation more frequently.
Or
Thank
we'll
you,
just
sir.
do this more often.
Okay, I like that too. Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much, Ima. Shabbat Shalom.
Shalom.